UNREST achieved funding from the Horizon 2020 program in 2016 on an agenda to rethink the hegemonic discourses on European violent pasts. The project takes its point of departure in the following hypothesis. That's one. The EU has fostered the foundational myth of the Union itself as a story of transnational reconciliation and peace, and relies upon a consensual approach to the traumatic memories of the conflicts of the past, especially the two world wars and the Holocaust, as a basic of social cohesion. On the other hand, populist and nationalist movements use the heritage of war and violent conflicts in opposition to official narratives of the United Europe in ways which risk fueling tension both within and across nation states. UNREST pursues the third memory way, which acknowledges and engages with widespread memory discontent without losing sight of fundamental EU ideals. You could have said democratic ideals here, but I mean, this is taken out of the application. That's the kind of thing you write into an EU application, I think. We call this way, this third way, the agonistic memory. It designates a new mode of remembrance which embraces political conflict as an opportunity for emotional and ethical growth. So the project includes the following web packages. Sorry, yeah, I cannot really see it from here. The web packages, administration and management, that's basically Stefan. Theory and methodology, that's where we are going to generalize experiences from the analytical web packages, and the two most important analytical web packages are the third one on the exhumations of mass graves and the war museums. We are now in the fourth one on war museums, right? Then we have two web packages on impact, communication and training impact, and the creation of cultural events. And then we have what is necessary in European framework, a web package on ethical issues. So within the analytical web packages on exhumations and museums, it is our aim to examine to what extent there is a pattern in the distribution of remembering modes between the two fields of study. And within the field of museum studies, it is of special interest to examine which contexts, agents, practices, and means are most suited for the promotion of an agonistic mode of remembering. The concept of agonism we are applying to the field of memory and museum studies has been inspired by the political philosopher Chantal Mouffe, and I'm just going to present very shortly the point of departure, theoretically speaking, for the project. So, according to Mouffe, contemporary society is a post-political society in the sense that neoliberalism has developed as a hegemonic ideology for several decades, and as liberalism in general has difficulties in recognizing social antagonisms, politics have degenerated into the negotiation of technicalities within a kind of undifferentiated political center. This situation does not allow average citizens to distinguish real alternatives, and politics have become an issue of morality, Mouffe says. Therefore, it is a present challenge to make the real and material differences of political interest visible. Hegemonic neoliberal ideology is radically demotivating political participation, while cosmopolitanism, as a liberal light version in the view of Mouffe, is promoted by the elites, and it cannot grasp or give expression to average people experiences of conflict and struggle, and therefore it leaves dangerous gaps for extreme nationalism to seize upon. This need for the creation of clear collective political identities make we-they relations necessary, But instead of conceiving of the other as an enemy to be destroyed in an antagonistic manner, the other should be seen as an adversary whose presence we admit within an agonistic and democratic setting. MOVE therefore speaks in favor of the development of a counter-hegemonic project and processes which at one and the same time can create passion for real political alternatives, challenge mainstream outlooks, and open the public sphere to the agonistic encounter of opposing worldviews within a democratic setting. So when it comes to agonism within the field of cultural memory and heritage, UNREST relies from the outset on an article published by Anna and myself, and according to this article it is possible to distinguish between three basic ethico-political modes of remembering: the antagonistic, the cosmopolitan, and the agonistic. Maybe we should just take this one. The dividing line between them depends on how they apply the moral categories of good and evil. Whereas antagonistic memory, nationalistic, religious, political, tends to apply moral terms to specific characters in the form of heroes and villains, cosmopolitan narratives tend to deconstruct this opposition in favor of a focus on the suffering of the passive and innocent victim. The narrative template developed as a transnational offspring of the Holocaust memory discourse depoliticizes the conflicts of the past in order to create compassion for individual suffering and call attention to the violation of human rights. In this sense, the moral categories of good and evil reproduce themselves, but now primarily attached to the ideological systems underlying the conflict: totalitarian rule versus democracy. The agonistic memory discourse acknowledges the existence of social and political conflict within a democratic society, but it shies away from the use of moral categories. Instead, it contextualizes the conflict and redefines the roles of the different characters. The simple roles of innocent victims and guilty perpetrators are recast as complicated relations between conflicting parties, and the social and political conditions that create the legitimate mass perpetration are revealed. This does not imply that evil acts are excused or legitimized, but they are not conceived of as the acts of evil persons. Instead, the social and political mechanisms historically involved in the creation of mass perpetration should be revealed. Social and economic inequality, the social marginalization of recognizable groups of people, the dehumanization of these people, and the reduction of their civil rights. In this sense, the agonistic memory discourse is a counter-hegemonic discourse which repoliticizes the binary categories of good and evil of the past, and by doing so, repoliticizes the relation of present society to the very past. When agonistic memory discourses sets out to understand what it takes to create a criminal of mass perpetration, the danger of being misunderstood obviously exists. Therefore, many, but not all, agonistic memory discourses apply what we call a multi-perspectivist approach to the narrative. The multi-perspectivist approach allows for the voice of the perpetrator to speak out in his or her own right, but opposes his or her self-understanding with that of other agents, such as victims, bystanders, and or historical successors. Through this dialogic juxtaposition of different discourse positions, the reader, or listener, or spectator will be enabled to take a qualified stand. Agonistic memory discourse is a deeply reflected and highly self-reflective discourse, conscious of its own social and political conditions, which at the same time arouses passion in order to engage people in issues of political conflict. And the cosmopolitan memory discourse is also reflective and dialogic, and it also often uses the multi-perspectivist approach, but the differences we think are nevertheless quite clear. Multi-perspectivism in cosmopolitan discourse can be used to dialogize different victims' positions or voices belonging to past and present, but it is used first and foremost as a means of deliberative reasoning over responsibility and guilt in the past and the present. It cannot allow the voice of the perpetrator to speak out in her or his own right and juxtapose it dialogically with other voices, representatives of other social and political positions. It is therefore not able to provide an understanding, and that's the important part, the understanding of why perpetration is created. It's not able to provide that understanding, so to speak, from the inside of how mass perpetration can be generated. It can only condemn it in a moral sense. So, last I want to say a few words upon agonism in museums. According to Chantal Mouffe, neoliberalism tends to reduce museums to sites of entertainment for public consumers, a public of consumers. But it is still possible for museums to become privileged spaces for escaping from the dominance of the market, she says. In her view, critical art is especially apt at promoting reflection and self-reflection and at prefiguring alternatives to the dominant social political order. And she mentions the MACBA, the Museum of Modern Art in Barcelona, as an example of a museum that has recovered its role as an educational institution, not least by forging close links with the city's social movements. Furthermore, Mouffe argues that artistic practices can mobilize people's emotions and in so doing, and I quote, play a decisive role in the construction of new forms of subjectivity, end of quote. Following Mouffe, Lilia Pozzi has argued, well, that's a problem. Oh. Right.
It's just the end.
That's unfortunate. That's really unfortunate.
Cut short by the machine.
Anders part is missing. It seems.
Can you do it without?
I've got this stick.
No. Like the whole thing.
Yeah, and I sent it to myself as an email as well. Email attachment. Maybe we can try with the stick and it could go on,
Or maybe.
Shall I?
I have been there last year. To be fair, I have just seen the exhibitions. Maybe I don't feel normal part of
I have it here. Could we put this one on? Is that?
Wish out.
So give me a stick. I sent it to you yesterday.
You sent it. One museum is not one. The last time I should have said that. Okay.
Not like this. That what I was thinking for.
Okay. All right. Can I get one scissors? So,
No, I have it. No problem.
It's not the
The
same.
only problem is time.
It's much longer.
It's not the same.
Well, he must have added one slide after but mine is here. My part is also there.
I have it here. Okay. Take it from here. So, meanwhile, I'll just continue. Following move, Celia Pozzi, they have argued that even national museums can engage with counter-hegemonic practices that portray the nation's hegemonic narrative at the same time that they destabilize their monolithic nature through counter-narratives. She warns Pozzi of possible dangers, including the risk that agonism turns into antagonism or into static acknowledgement of conflicting positions, and she puts forward some suggestions as to how the constraints of a traditional historical museum can be bypassed. One suggestion is to privilege temporary and thematic exhibitions over permanent and chronological ones. Another is to make consistent use of information and communication technologies, ICTs, which allow interactive practices in multiple perspectives. ICT can also involve visitors in the construction of the museum's narratives, as well as accommodate conflicting voices, he says. Mouffe and Pozzi, therefore... Okay, very good. Thank you. Mouffe and Pozzi therefore argue that museums can be transformed into agonistic spaces, both in terms of how to incorporate dissonant voices and perspectives, and in terms of how they can open up bottom-up participation in the part of grassroots movements. However, the issue of which actors would have the power and the agency to impress this transformation upon existing museums is open as a question and due to concrete research and examination. Finally, Mouffe suggests that museums traditionally have had an educational function for what she calls, and I quote, construction of bourgeois hegemony. This function, she says, has presently been overshadowed by the consumerist function, but the educational function can be re-established in a new counter-hegemonic guise. In our view, however, museums engage in a much wider range of functions than just educators and entertainers. For instance, as Hinz argues, in countries that have overcome apartheid, dictatorship, war, and flight and expulsion, museums have become places of reconciliation, as well as commemoration. One example of this is the newly opened Museum for the Memoirs to Center Srebrenica Polucari, on the site of the former headquarters of the Dutch UNPROFOR battalion in Srebrenica, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Financed mainly by Dutch government, it also represents a way in which the Dutch attempt to come to terms with feelings of guilt and regret. In this sense, this is also an example of a museum that attempts to negotiate divisive memories of the past, both at the national and international levels. As Sharon MacDonald remarked, we are witnessing an internationalization of how memory is performed, a process in which other countries act as models and also sometimes provide direct assistance in the creation of public representations. As documented by Clark, Sensible, and Diganati, museums also play a role in states' cultural diplomacy and soft power, an area where supranational institutions like the EU have started to become involved. And now I will leave the floor to Anna.
Okay, thank you. How do I go down? Do you have any Okay. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank all the museum curators who are here. And I think it's quite unnerving to have you here in many ways, because you may fully contradict what I'm going to say, but that's going to be good. As Hans said, we want disagreement and not agreement necessarily. So let me talk briefly about this work package 4, which was the work package on war museums. First of all, what did we want to do in relation to the theory? You've heard all about the theory from Hans. What did we want to do when we chose 5 museums to analyze in depth? What we wanted to do was to test the theory and revise the theory on the basis of 2 empirical work packages, and one of them was on war museums specifically. So we wanted to generate new empirical data and really test the concepts of cosmopolitan, antagonistic and agonistic memory. And how did we choose the museums? We had a set of criteria. We wanted museums that specialize in both the First and the Second World War, that were established after 1990, or perhaps established much long before that then, but museums which had renovated their main exhibitions so that it would allow for meaningful comparisons. Museums in both Western and Eastern Europe, and also a variety of smaller museums and larger ones. Okay, how did we carry out the field work? This was one very interesting aspect, I think, of our UNREST project, that there were 9 researchers working together on the 5 museums. All the curators saw us, they saw a big group of us going into the room where they very kindly and generously gave us their time for interviews and they answered quite challenging questions. So there were 3, and I must say, that way of carrying out research was extremely fruitful, extremely productive. There were 3 stages of the research. The first one, we studied the origins of each museums, we looked at archives, minutes of meetings as much as that was possible. We carried out interviews with main stakeholders. The second phase was a detailed analysis of the museum exhibitions. Again, all of us visited all of the museums and discussed what we found. I'm sorry, the third one is missing, but the third one is an analysis of visitors' reactions to the exhibitions. And what we did, we carried out a number of interviews with visitors, chosen more or less at random. About 30 interviews per museum with visitors, and also, and this is ongoing, we are studying the visitors' books of comments. Okay, so here are the 5 museums. The first one is the Historial de la Grande Gare in France, in Peronne. The second one is the Kobarid Museum in Slovenia. We have the German-Russian Museum here in Berlin, the Military History Museum in Dresden, and Schindler's Factory Museum in Krakow. The Historial was opened in 1992, also quite striking for its architecture. It has about 70,000 visitors per year. The same can be said for the Kobarid Museum, which is a small museum in Slovenia, but visited very much by international visitors. It's also notable because it was the site of a major Italian defeat in 1917. The German-Russian Museum was previously a Soviet museum, but was obviously revamped after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It has about 40,000 visitors per year. The Military History Museum is the largest in terms of space and very striking architecturally, and also the largest in terms of number of visitors, with about 500,000 visitors per year. And finally, the Schindler's Factory Museum, very well known because it's partly because of the film on Schindler. And it has roughly 240,000 visitors per year. Okay, so what did we find in relation to agonism? Well, Hans has spoken about the various roles that museums play. And this was one of the main findings, that museums, I mean, you heard from Hans that MOVE tended to talk about two main functions by museum, the commercial function and the entertaining commercial function and the educational function. We found that museums play many more roles, complex roles, and these roles act as constraints on the type of main exhibition that these museums put on. Sometimes they can act as facilitators as well. And the main roles that are influential in terms of war museums, we found the political role, especially the political influence that is exercised when the museums are established, and also the diplomatic role that all of them effectively played. So we linked these roles to the approach taken in the museum exhibitions, and we concluded that the museums tended to adopt either a cosmopolitan approach or a mix of cosmopolitan and antagonism rather than an agonistic approach. So very, very briefly, let me go through the museums and explain why I'm saying what I'm saying, starting with the Kobarid Museum, established in 1990, just 1 year before Slovenian unification, and established under a local initiative, and where the main aim was mainly to regenerate the locality economically and attract tourists, especially from Italy. This led to a decision, a conscious decision, not to delve into the issue of the Italian defeat, which could have been perceived as humiliating by visitors, and so the museum opted for an explicit anti-war message, but perhaps rather a generic one as well. And since then, the museum has become a very important site for hosting diplomatic encounters at the international level, including very important encounters with Russia. Finally, the museum plays a role in shifting, if you like, the memory in Slovenia, the memory culture from the memory of the Second World War to the memory of the First World War, which is less contentious and which also helped Slovenia to present itself with a Europeanized version of history. Peron Museum was set up under a local initiative. Also, one of the aims was to attract visitors and tourists from all over Europe. As J. Winter, a famous historian of the First World War and closely connected with the museum itself, as he argued, this was a transnational project from the start. I can't go into the reasons for that now. But like Kobarid, these museums developed an important role in transnational commemorative and reconciliation diplomacy. And like Kobarid, this role reinforced the cosmopolitan approach adopted originally by the museum. Okay, if we move to the German-Russian Museum, this museum is a partnership between two countries, so it plays a very obvious diplomatic role. And the exhibition itself has been negotiated within a committee made up by representatives from Germany and from Russia. And the museum, the main exhibition can be best defined as a mixture of cosmopolitan intentions brought from the German side and more antagonistic, traditionally heroic representations which wielded by the Russians. Schindler's Factory, the museum's main stakeholder was the city council, and decisions about the main exhibitions were taken by a committee with representatives of the city council, obviously, of curators and of designers. And minutes of the meetings of this committee has shown that there were differing views, sometimes even contrasting views. And what has prevailed in the exhibition is a mix of an antagonistic approach and the cosmopolitan one. And what we have is the Germans generally are presented as the villains, even though this perspective is partially redeemed by the story of Schindler as a hero, positive hero. The Jews are presented mainly as passive victims and Poles as both victims and heroes. And the Dresden Military History Museum is perhaps the museum which in some ways showed more elements of agonism in the main exhibition. However, even this museum, it comes under the authority of the Bundeswehr, and it fulfills an important PR role for the German army. And also it has an explicit educational role vis-à-vis the soldiers, because it has to educate soldiers to the values and norms of the liberal democratic order. So there are constraints over this museum and the decisions it can take in relation to the exhibition. Okay, so now what I want to do now is to shift to political diplomatic considerations becoming opportunities for agonism in some cases. In some cases we can talk about windows of opportunities that open up for agonism. And in the paper I have two examples. One is about the Polin Museum in Poland, and I wish to thank here Joanna and Barbara as well, who very, very kindly gave us a lot of information in interviews, and Joanna took us round, acted as a splendid guide to the museum. Unfortunately, I cannot talk about that example today, I don't have the time. So I'm talking about the agonism in the Dresden Military Museum. Why do we think that political diplomatic factors played a role in allowing for more agonism in this museum? Because when it was conceived, the new exhibition was conceived, it was a time when the German army had to rethink its role and its identity. It merged with the army of the GDR, first of all, and secondly, its reputation was severely dented when the exhibition War of Annihilation, Crimes of the Wehrmacht, 1941 to 1944, was shown in 34 German cities between 1995 and 1999. And this sparked a huge controversy in Germany. There were mass demonstrations, counter-demonstrations, and I have a quotation here by one of the curators. We had expected to hit a nerve in society with this topic, but had not expected to hit a nerve center. So obviously that led to a break with the past in terms of the kind of exhibition that the Dresden Museum could design and conceive. And the resulting exhibition is quite provoking. As Christian Churchill has shown, who is also over there, is one of our researchers. There are several elements of agonism in the exhibition. I cannot go over them now, which are enhanced by the use of artistic installations, ICT as well. So, for instance, the role of emotions and passions in social, political, and military conflicts is fully acknowledged, and there is a wide element, a wide range of multi-perspectives. However, there have been criticism of this museum. In 2016, Heckler labeled it a bystander museum, stating that it refrains from taking positions on issues, and also of showing a war in terms of a generic, quite generic anthropological human propensity towards war, rather than really exploring the factors and the social political struggles leading to war. So this was recently addressed by two exhibitions, and again, as Christian Churchill has shown, the first of these two exhibitions on radical right-wing violence in Germany from 1990 to 2013 did delve into socio-political processing, material structures, and he links these processes to the rise of the far right. And this also is interesting because it appears, this was true of many of the museums we analyzed, it appears that temporary exhibitions can allow many curators to be more controversial, to address more controversial issues than they can in the main exhibition. Okay. So, in conclusion, you'll be happy to know. So political diplomatic factors at national and international levels tend to work against agonism. This is was one of the main findings. At times, however, they can also provide opportunities for curators and historians to develop agonistic and dissonant elements in exhibitions. However, it seems to us that what is really important is that there has to be a degree of mobilization of an engagement with grassroots social movements to be able to amplify the impact of agonism in museums and to allow museums to have a role in countering hegemonic representations. Okay, thank you.